We have a quorum ready to go.
Okay, good. All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the council workshop for Monday, February 1st at 7 o'clock. This meeting is being held entirely virtually. No members are gathered together for this meeting. To that end, we've circulated a resolution in the agenda to notify that this meeting is being held without the public in attendance. And so, councillors, can I have someone from council please move that notice? Okay, Councillor Hanson, second by Councillor Murray. I'm going to call the question on the motion. All those in favor? Contrary minded? Motion carries. Okay, and council, we have an agenda that's been circulated. Are there any errors or omissions from the agenda as presented? Hearing none, will someone move adoption of the agenda?
Moved.
Moved by Councillor Murray, second by Councillor Back. I'll call the question on the motion. All those in favor? Contrary minded? Motion carries. Okay, now we have our reports from council or staff. Tonight we're going to be having sort of a combined recap of where we were at. Obviously when the OCP, we started our targeted review, we had started to do public engagement on the draft documents back in March of 2020. And then obviously COVID came down and shut down our in-person operations and sort of changed our timeline somewhat. And so we had started some of the meetings. So part of tonight will be a recap of what we had heard in those first two meetings, but then also looking through a lens of COVID and how we're going to proceed forward from this point. And so at this point, I'm going to just turn the matter over to Mr. Milburn just for some opening comments.
Well, thank you, and good evening, Mayor Little and members of council. Our staff team and consultants are very excited to be here tonight, and I know we're all quite proud of the white paper work and the COVID supplements that you see in tonight's agenda. It has been quite a year. While during the pandemic we have been able to maintain municipal operations for the community, it was clear, that early on that taking a temporary pause on the targeted official community plan review was the right thing to do. We are now ready to once again pick up where we left off and move forward with this review. In order to ensure our collective readiness, staff and our consulting team will provide an overview of the material included in tonight's agenda package and then answer questions. I'd now like to introduce Ms. Atva, the District's Manager of Community Planning, who will introduce the consulting team and provide council with more information on the format for tonight and the process going forward. Thank you, Worship.
Thank you, Mr. Milburn. Ms. Atva.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Your Worship, members of council and staff, and all those who are tuning in today. This is a 2-hour workshop as part of the Targeted Official Community Plan Review. It was May 2019 when council gave the direction to staff to do a focused review of our 20-year municipal vision. The goal of this review was to look at 4 key areas where issues had maybe changed so much from the time when the OCP was adopted in 2011. Council's direction was to look at housing, climate emergency, transportation, and economy and employment lands. So as we resume this process, we are mindful of all the work that has been done to date, and we know that there is still more work to do as we head towards an action plan. We also know that a lot has changed because of the pandemic, because of stronger desires for social justice, that this work is pulling us together at this time in a very unique way. I'll introduce the consultants who are helping us today and who have been helping us since last year. They will come in at different parts of the workshop. First off will be Alison Clavel, who's our project lead with Urban Systems, and we'll be doing a refresher on the transportation white paper. Next, we'll have David Bell, who will be giving us a refresher and recap on employment and economy. And then we'll spend more time with Jody Reckenmacher on the climate emergency. On this slide, and I'll say Nicole Foth, our project coordinator in community planning, is helping with the control the slides today. So thank you, Nicole. So again, the targeted review, we're looking at 4 key areas. And what we want to do is remember that the vision that we have in our official community plan was one that council continued to say, we believe in this vision. And I always look it up again to look at it, and I find it that there's a very, lots of really good words that I get a lot of meaning from, and I'll share some parts of that. We are a community of vibrant neighborhoods and centers. We are an inclusive community, that we celebrate our rich heritage and live in harmony with nature. We have a wide range of housing options. Our local businesses are diverse and offer an array of employment. We have an enviable pedestrian and cycling network that connects us to our destinations, and our community effectively addresses and adapts to climate change. Those are just some of the pieces that I pulled out of the vision in the official community plan that I think highlight where we want to go, where we agree that we continue to want to strive for by the year 2030, which was the 20-year time frame of our vision, only 9 years away now. The action plan, again, is intended to look at specifically the issues in the 4 areas: climate emergency, housing, transportation, and employment and economy. These are to address the issues that we've seen around congestion, the lack of affordability, the difficulty businesses have to stay viable and attract keep workers, and our dependence on private vehicles and fossil fuels. So this is the scope of the project, the targeted review, and our action plan is to help us get to that in a very coordinated and intentional way. Next slide, please. This recaps the process. Some of the process that we've been going through so far starts just in fall of 2019 when we did a telephone survey with Mustel on the 4 topic areas. And even just before that, I remember the summer that I started working here when the planners were doing intercept surveys, that is catching people on the street and where they were and starting to talk to them about the OCP. And that was about 100 people who we were able to talk to. The stakeholder workshops, this is, flashback only a year ago, yet so much has happened when we did a detailed workshop with stakeholders on each of those 4 areas, and also with the North Vancouver Community Association Network. We did white papers and snapshots with Urban Systems Support, and the white papers, all the information I'm referring to is on our website under the DNV targeted OCP review. The workshops really were a way to pull together kind of where we were, the best that we could think of on each of those areas. And we'll go over them a little bit more shortly. The white papers look at what does the OCP say right now? What is the vision when it comes to housing? What's the progress that we've made since 2011? What are some of those issues and what are some best practices and what are some possible ways to address those issues? So just before we were paused in this process because of the pandemic, Council was able to have 1 workshop on 2 of those white papers. And we're going to refresh those ones today since it has been a fair length of time. That'll be transportation and, again, employment and economy lands. When we came back to Council to get direction to restart this process back in October, Council gave direction as well to do a couple things. We did some community engagement with social service stakeholders in early December, and we'll be speaking about that more at our next workshop. As well, we did some engagement with local businesses and small businesses with a survey and with a couple info sessions, and we'll be speaking about that today as well. The Council report has the attachments there that I'm referring to, the small business survey, as well as the COVID supplements, as we're calling them. These are short but concise pieces of review that look at housing, look at transportation, employment, and climate emergency from the perspective of the pandemic that has befallen us. How are the issues been affected? What have we seen? What actions have been working? What steps might we be able to take? So that takes us to where we are today, a Council workshop series. This is the first of what could be 4 today, and next week we're aiming for the second one, and then through the mid-end part of February. Let's keep in mind that we're really trying to develop an action plan before the summer and a final action plan in September. And this next slide will be my last one before I turn it over to Allison. But again, here we are for today, February 1st. We will be spending about 10 minutes each on a refresher for transportation and economy and employment lands. And then we'll pause there for questions and conversation that you might have. What we'd like to do about 8 o'clock is make sure that we have ample time, because this will be the first time to tackle the climate emergency white paper. And that's when Jody will start off that conversation with white paper highlights, as well as highlighting what's changed since COVID started. We're intending that next week, February 9th, will be another 2-hour workshop. That'll be earlier in the evening, 5 o'clock, where we'll address the white paper on housing, as well as look at it from that COVID perspective. And we also want to bring forward a social equity lens, which will also look at a framework and ideas for how to more carefully look at this part of the OCP review that is really critical to make sure we're looking at social equity in the issues and actions that are put forward. And then give you a sense for all the work that's ahead, workshops 3 and 4. This is really where we'll also be rolling up your sleeves, all of our sleeves, for a facilitated discussion. We'll be bringing in our facilitator, Lieven Callawert, to help us and help all of us through that process. So today and next week is really about sharing and discussing information. There is a lot to refresh and to come back together on. You know, please help us write down your comments, questions, and we will break after each of the refreshers and then come to have a full rest of discussion on the housing, on the climate emergency. Next slide. So this is now where I'll turn it over for about next 10 minutes or so to Allison. And then when Allison's done, we'll turn it over to David Bell. And that's when we'll all come back together. And if you could please have your questions and thoughts and ideas ready at that point. That's our thought for how we can manage the time today, since there is a lot of material and limited time. And thank you for the time. We really appreciate being able to come back with you on the targeted OCP review.
Your worship, if I could make just a quick comment.
Mr. Stewart, go ahead.
I provided council with a brief on the impact of COVID. I did that without necessarily the benefit of the white paper on COVID that's being produced. So one of the questions that you may want to think about towards the end of the evening is whether we need, and council had requested a more public presentation by myself on the impacts of COVID as to whether or not this, in fact, presentation, which is a public workshop, is sufficient. If it's not, then fine, we can schedule something else. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we've set aside a number of nights for workshops, and some of them are optional depending on how things are going. And so we do have some time set aside into March that we could potentially cover that somewhere between here and there and fit it in. We do have some flexibility on the time. Thank you, Ms. Atfa, for your intro. Now on to Allison Clavel. Welcome.
Thank you, Mayor Little. Good evening, members of council, your worship. Our team is really pleased to be with you here tonight to speak about the OCP review and some of the original work we did, as well as our updated work. Next slide. I'm going to focus on transportation to provide a refresh on what we originally spoke about back in March and to present some new information about how COVID-19 has changed the transportation context. The goal that was set for transportation in the OCP remains relevant, and you will remember that the district has made progress towards this goal, but that there is still more to do. Next slide. In March, we spoke about how one of the central issues around transportation is that it's difficult to get around the district by all modes of transportation. Congestion and delay in driving also reduce the convenience and reliability of transit service, which is caught up in the same traffic. Infrastructure gaps can make walking and cycling feel inconvenient and unsafe in some locations, creating an overall challenge with transportation across the district. At the time, we had identified a longer list of actions, but we focused on 3 main things that we expected to make the biggest difference to address transportation issues of residents and businesses, as well as to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So those three big things, the first one was to get transit moving. Many of the cornerstones that actually required for reliable transit are within the control of municipality. Things like transit priority measures and transit lanes, transit queue jumps, signal priority, those are all things that municipalities can deliver and work with TransLink to create a more reliable transit system. The second thing we talked about back in March was to invest in infrastructure for walking and cycling. Walking and cycling in the district have increased between 2011 and 2017, but there are still gaps that prevent people of all ages and abilities from safely and comfortably using walking and wheeling or cycling to reach their most important destinations. Also, the increase is not moving fast enough to achieve your target, so there's lots of room there for investment. The third thing we identified back in March was to direct growth towards the town and village centers in order to build complete communities with great active transportation networks and strong connections to frequent transit. We know that this is the best way to shorten trips, to make more trips by walking, cycling, and transit, and to provide better connectivity for everyone to the destinations they want to get to. This also provides opportunity to leverage development in order to build those safe, comfortable walking and cycling infrastructure pieces for people of all ages and abilities. So next slide, I'm going to move on quickly here. So COVID-19, these are some of the quotes that we collected at the time that really prove out some of those challenges around how frustrating it can be to get around the district by all modes of transportation. So next slide. COVID-19 has been an unprecedented challenge for people and families and has fundamentally changed the way we move, work, and live. It has required governments and households to really rethink how we allocate resources, and it has spotlighted some of the underlying issues and struggles across many different groups of people. Next slide. From a transportation perspective, there are three main patterns I want to talk about that address these immediate impacts and lessons learned, the pandemic response, and what we expect to be the longer term key trends and emerging issues. So first, the single largest change to ground transportation patterns that we saw throughout the pandemic has been how the number and distance of trips that we make got smaller. So in the early days of the regional health orders, we found that traffic volumes across bridges and other key locations dropped between 30% and 50%. Transit volumes dropped even more than that. Transit ridership completely fell off. As the pandemic has progressed and we have released some health orders, roadway volumes rebounded. Now they're about 10% of what they used to be, 10% under typical daily volumes. But this 10% reduction isn't split evenly over the day. A lot of the day has actually completely come back to normal travel levels of our roadways, but the peak direction, peak trips. So think about from the North Shore to Vancouver in the morning and from Vancouver to the North Shore in the afternoon, those still remain down. It's about 20% in the morning and 15% in the afternoon over the Ironworkers Memorial and Lion Gate Bridge. So this really shows what the impact is of the ongoing transition to work from home for the people who can work from home. This opens up an opportunity of what could be even long-term to reduce the demands at the busiest times of day. So we do know that not everybody can work from home. And the ability to work from home is tied to education and income levels and other things. But a survey by the BC CDC did find that over 65% of residents of the North Shore have been able to work from home remotely during the pandemic. And we can link that to those reduction in peak trips, which are, again, the busiest time of day. So as I said, transit trips also dropped off quite substantially during the beginning of the pandemic. They still have not recovered the way that driving trips have recovered. Right now, a fall is still around, or transit trips are still around about 45% of pre-COVID levels. But what we've also found is that people still on transit are the people that really need transit. Those people cannot work from home, and they're providing the types of services that allow us to respond to the pandemic, including people in healthcare. We found, and TransLink found, and senior levels of government found that they had to keep funding transit to respond to the pandemic, which really shows us how essential transit service is to keep our society moving. Longer term, we do expect transit ridership to really rebound. Surveys have found that most people who used to be transit riders expect to go back to transit once they're vaccinated. So there continues to be the potential for long-term growth in transit ridership, similar to what we would have expected pre-pandemic. So the number two thing I want to talk about around how COVID has transformed transportation is how we saw the refocusing more locally and needing more space to walk and cycle and activate the streets really taught us how. They taught us how we can repurpose streets to make more space for people, to make more space to activate streets, to walk and cycle. So the changes that the district has made in Deep Cove along Gallant are a really great example how municipalities have responded to the pandemic to use public space, public streets, to create more space to serve people. So as people stay closer to home, they were actually able to connect and access their own local shops and services. They were able to get outdoors to recreate safely within their own neighborhoods where there was a strong active transportation system to support that and where they were close enough to those kind of destinations. So as an industry, we saw this concept of 15-minute neighborhoods really keep coming up more and more. And now a 15-minute neighborhood is a neighborhood where everything someone needs in their day-to-day life is within a 15-minute walk of their home. That can work really well alongside buy local initiatives and the conversion of street space to walking, cycling, and activation to allow urban neighborhoods to continue to support people and businesses. And we really saw that during the pandemic, how some of those urban neighborhoods were able to support their residents and support their businesses through some of these conversions. And there's also a long-term potential trend here. So as we see senior levels of government inject funding for stimulus money into active transportation, there's a potential to make these short-term shifts long-term. There's a huge opportunity that's coming up there. So the third thing I want to talk about as far as our kind of lessons learned and trends is that people and businesses of all sizes are moving towards pickup, drop-off, delivery models. We saw local businesses, including restaurants and retail, escalate kind of hybrid brick and mortar and e-commerce businesses where they were selling online and then you could pick up, or things through online apps where you could order food from restaurants that maybe didn't used to provide online orders. This format requires much more high turnover of our curbside space. It makes our curbside space in all types of neighborhoods much more valuable and in much higher demand. And it's really asked us as an industry and as governments to question what the best use is of that valuable curbside space, which is a large publicly owned asset. So we expect, looking even further forward, that the rise of automated vehicles will reduce the use of curbside space for vehicle storage, as AVs become more common, but increase pressure for pickup and drop off. And that will really further accelerate the changes we've seen through COVID-19. So next slide, how has this changed what actions should be brought to the surface? So we identified 4 things we think we should elevate here. And I want to say that COVID-19 didn't really fundamentally shift the actions municipalities need to take. What it did was it elevated some and kind of increased their importance and the relative urgency of them. So first thing I wanted to mention of the 4 is to leverage funding from senior levels of government. So the Canada Infrastructure Program is one example of funding that's available from senior governments in response to the pandemic. Municipalities that have clear project plans for active transportation, for transit, and for other high priority infrastructure will be able to leverage recovery and resiliency investments to accomplish their broader goals. So the district's recent application to the Canada Infrastructure Program for Livable Deep Cove is a great example of how you can leverage that kind of funding to accomplish broader goals. Number 2, continue to develop diverse land uses and complete transportation networks with great transit connectivity in the town and village centers. So we learned that the most resilient neighborhoods, the ones where businesses have been able to survive and people have been able to continue to access the services they need, are those 15-minute neighborhoods. We saw during the pandemic, through a lot of research, that main streets that serve local, higher density residential land uses did better overall through the pandemic than those that focus on tourism. The town and village centers envisioned in the OCP are an excellent example of 15-minute neighborhoods. And they continue to be central in addressing some of the district's issues in transportation, but also across all the topic areas. Number 3, support and promote work from home for municipal employees and for residents. We've seen that potential of work from home and its reach in reducing the busiest times and directions of travel. Transportation demand management approaches and other tools can help us reduce that peak travel and also reduce the demand on parking supply during the busiest times. So this kind of focusing on residents and incentivizing residents to work from home, and also the district as a leader for its own staff can really help move this one forward. And if this happens in tandem with town center development, it can also animate the town centers as more people are working from home and able to shop and recreate around their home during the day. So finally, the 4th thing is to accelerate the study and implementation of improved curbside management. So as I noted, there's increased pressure on the curbside space, and a really great way to support businesses that David will talk about later in their transition to new models is to make sure that they have sufficient space available to them for those pickup and drop-offs that are becoming much more common and are really essential to the viability of businesses. We want to also support residents in new retail patterns, especially those in higher density areas, to make sure that they can receive goods and services from the curbside. Really, it's about thinking carefully about what the highest and best use of that public asset that is curbside space. So that's everything I have for now, and we're not going to take questions right now, as Ms. Adva mentioned. I'm going to pass it over to David, and then we'll both take questions after his presentation.
Okay.
Your Worship, if I could just make one quick comment.
I think, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that what you've just heard supports the notion that although we have made adjustments during COVID, some of those adjustments are going to be ongoing into the future. And so what we have to do as an organization, even if, for example, in 2022, there's no COVID, for example, some of the behavioral changes that have occurred in the community will likely persist. And particularly with respect to the use of technology and a variety of things. So that's going to be one of our challenges, irrespective of COVID. How do we pivot to a new future that's being changed by COVID? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. David Bell.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. As we heard during the workshop last year, the main goal from an economy and an employment lands perspective from the LCP is to support a diverse and resilient local economy that provides quality employment opportunities. That's never been more true than today, post-COVID. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk about is to start with progress since 2011. So what's interesting is more than 4,600 jobs were added to the district between 2011 and 2016, meaning that you reached 32,700 jobs, or about 90% of the OCP's goal of 36,000 by 2030. What's also important is the economic diversity. So no single sector in your economy accounts for more than 11% of the total workforce, which is important. I'm going to mention 3 issues and related causes from the original white paper. 1, local employers are finding it challenging to attract and retain workers, and it's due to a lack of affordable housing choice and a lack of reliable transportation options. Number 2 is independent businesses are finding it increasingly difficult to survive, and that's really a combination of rising costs, including rising commercial property assessments, including triple net leases, and compounded by the employee retention challenges I mentioned in number 1. And 3, local businesses are also finding it challenging to expand in place in the district, due in part to limited land supply and also some perceptions around challenges in seeking approvals. In terms of how this topic connects to the other topic areas, it's very clear. The number one and number two issues from a local business economy perspective are transportation and housing by far. So what would make a difference? Number one, improved housing choice and implementation of North Shore transportation plans. Number two, improved cooperation and collaboration with economic partners and major employers to explore local employer issues and solutions to their issues. And number three, continued evolution of town centers to focus more jobs, housing, and commercial amenities within more transit-friendly nodes. Next slide, please. So these issues are nicely summarized in these two quotes. I'll focus on the second one because it really just echoes both of them. And it's the fact that there are a myriad of issues that really do need to be addressed, but that they really pale in comparison to the number one and number two issues, which are housing and transportation related challenges. Next slide, please. So it's been quite a year. One of the key aspects of this whole work program and assignment is to look at how the actions might change through our experience of COVID. So I'm going to talk about immediate impacts and lessons learned to start. So number one, there's been a dramatic spike in e-commerce sales. That's no surprise to anyone. It's driven by an increased work at home activity, as well as increased comfort levels of residents and workers with online shopping during the pandemic. And what that really showed is as Allison mentioned, a need for increased attention to curbside management because businesses are pivoting to more pickup and delivery options, and we're seeing increased volumes there. Number two, we're seeing an acceleration in challenges for smaller Main Street type businesses. So it hasn't changed their issues, it's only just added weight to them. Essentially, dealing with COVID for local businesses of all types, including restaurants, has meant that their operational costs have essentially gone up while their revenues have been strained. And the North Vancouver Chamber did a series of surveys and found that the most pressing COVID-related issues facing businesses on the North Shore are the following. A, local customer and employee confidence in safe public transit use. B, some inconsistencies across business types and workplaces in terms of application of recommended public health measures. And C and D are just getting customers and employees back post-COVID. Three, the BC North Shore film industry was really hit hard with immediate shutdowns, as people know, back in March, but it did bounce back better than most sectors. And one of the keys to that was strong and consistent application of public health and worker safety guidelines in alignment with BC's phase 3 opening, which I believe launched in August. Number four, tourism-driven businesses were particularly hit hard by COVID. This is especially true of destination businesses like the Capilano Suspension Bridge Park, which relies heavily on cruise ship and international tourists, which we all know fell off a cliff during the early part of COVID and continues to be a challenge. Interestingly enough, Grouse Mountain was also impacted by this, but the local winter visitor volumes have certainly helped. And the lesson there is the local visitation matters now more than ever. Five, restaurants were heavily impacted locally and throughout the region. According to the BC Restaurant and Food Services Association, they estimate that about 20% of the province's businesses have closed due to COVID, which is a staggering number, and that it could hit 30% before restrictions ease. One of the lessons that we've learned in looking at the district and other markets is that local business clusters and destinations are both benefiting from what we call staycation marketing campaigns. And those are focused on driving local visitation in light of the fact that international and out-of-province visitation is down. What has the local pandemic response to these challenges been? There's a few really interesting things that have happened here. Number one is on the aspect of improved data collection and outreach. So a business survey was conducted by the district in December. 180 businesses participated. they reiterated, and it's always good to reiterate where we're at, that the top business challenges in the North Shore are housing and transportation, and the highest and best use approach to property taxation, which has driven significant tax increases for local businesses. The top potential actions they'd like to see are supporting implementation of North Shore transportation plans, streamlining permitting processes, and continuing to advocate for provincial tax reform through the UBCM. Number two, the district was an early adopter in supporting restaurants by instituting and extending relaxed permitting approvals for critical outdoor patio space. So this is a program that has now been extended to October 31st, 2021, but we also see it as a really great opportunity to evaluate other potential uses for public space. And it's interesting to note that since the program was installed, 13 of these patio spaces have been approved to date across the district, including in Deep Cove, Edgemont, Maplewood, and Lynn Creek. Number three, the district and the city of North Van are working with CapU to help build online platforms for small to medium local businesses. As Allison mentioned, as businesses want to pivot, not away from brick and mortar, but in order to complement their brick and mortar operations, these programs are really helping them find new ways to reach their customer base. Number four, a City of North Van report recommends that both the District of North Vancouver and the District of West Vancouver work with the City of North Vancouver and the Vancouver North Shore Tourism Association to support an ongoing staycation marketing campaign, more broadly targeting the North Shore as a whole. And we see that as an important initiative to help drive more local visitation. In terms of longer term key trends and emerging issues, I want to talk about three. One is ongoing office market disruption. So as businesses reevaluate their total space needs, one thing that we've noticed in the region is an increase in sublease space across the region. And we want to just alert people to the fact that local businesses that are struggling with their current North Shore location due to either cost or housing or transportation issues may be considering more affordable office locations elsewhere. So that's something to watch. Number two, as was mentioned earlier by a number of people, is online shopping growth is here to stay. I've been watching retail for two to 3 decades, and I've never seen this much growth in online shopping. It may have started out of necessity and convenience, but what it's done is it's created new comfort levels for a broader customer base. And we see that as being important because municipalities, such as the district, will be challenged to support their local business districts as they see increased proportions of delivery and pickup options. Number three is that restaurants are now faced, even beyond COVID, with new customer comfort levels. So even post-vaccine, customers have a different level of comfort with being around multiple people in small spaces than they did before, which means that we'll probably see ratios of seats to floor area drop relative to more traditional levels. And you'll probably see more restaurants likely to seek external seating options to better manage their capacity and revenues. So that's a hint that maybe some temporary programs could be extended into the future to support their growth. Now, there are a number of key things that we see that COVID has maybe changed or added weight to in terms of the OCP goals, and I'm just going to mention 5 of them. One is just an ongoing call to continue to support UBCM's ongoing discussions with the province regarding property tax assessments. It was one of the #1 things mentioned in the business survey I mentioned earlier. Businesses are struggling with that, and it's only been accentuated by the COVID pandemic as they're struggling with operational costs. And the province's initial response was an interim kind of business property tax relief program, but it doesn't address the underlying issue of the challenge of properties being taxed at their full development potential rather than current use. Number 2, support businesses as they adjust to post-COVID realities. So as Allison mentioned, businesses are expanding their digital social media presence to complement their brick and mortar businesses. The district should continue to partner with the city of North Van and CapU to support their expanded digital platforms for local businesses. And that's a program that's leveraging Metrovan's Regional Prosperity Initiative and their Digital Main Street program. And B, reevaluate curbside management, which we've talked about often during this presentation. Number 3 is to collaborate with the North Vancouver Chamber to explore efforts to retain head offices feeling the pressure to relocate. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. 4, support continued investment in the district's town centers, especially when it comes to concentrating housing, employment, and commercial amenities to support increased public transit service. So if anything, the COVID-19 experience has shown that more local, resident-focused main streets, as Allison mentioned, are tending to fare better than purely tourism-oriented main streets. And mixed-use town centers are also better able to provide housing and transit for local workers for whom work at home is not an option. So that's important. Finally, number 5, undertake a district-wide employment land strategy. And the reason you would do that is to better understand market shifts post-COVID and to refine the district's employment land and development goals relating to floor space demand by type and area. And we feel like this would be an excellent way to better understand and frame the growth potential in a post-COVID world of target mixed employment areas, including Maplewood. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just checking back in, I guess, so at this point it's question and answer for both Allison and David's presentation. Is that correct?
That's correct. Thank you very much.
Okay, Council, just a quick check-in, and we intend to do these check-ins about every 10 minutes from now going to the end of the meeting. Are there questions on the first 2 portions of the presentation? Councillor Bond.
Thanks, Mayor Little, and I'd like to thank staff and our consulting team for all the work that you've done. I was pleasantly surprised to read through the amount of detail that was put into the COVID supplements for each of the different topic areas. I think it really summarizes what's been a really challenging time for us to understand. It's very difficult when you're in the middle of something to kind of think about and monitor and then project the future when the present is currently changing so quickly. So I really appreciate all the work that you've done to pull together all these all the different happenings in the municipal sector and how they link with different parts of the economy and housing and transportation and climate as you've done. So really appreciate that work. I'm really pleased to see that. I do have a couple of questions, and I think let me go. I'll kind of work through as we did here in the presentation. So I guess the first questions would be for Allison. I'm wondering if your team has put into some of the some thought into some of the challenges that arise from a municipal perspective on having more people work from home. What challenges we've heard from our CAO, Mr. Stewart, about kind of corporate challenges, but are there other challenges, community-wide challenges with having more people work from home? Where does that shift need for other community services? If you have any thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, it's an interesting angle and an interesting question. I mean, from a transportation perspective, I would say it really accelerates that need for really great walking and cycling connections and connections to outdoor recreation areas. If people are working and working from home, they're there all day. They need more of those services accessible within their own community that they would typically get within their work community. So really that investment in walking and cycling comfortably in neighborhoods becomes really essential.
Great. And I'm wondering, maybe following up on that, I think in the papers here, and you mentioned it yourself, that working from home seems to be an option for those that are already have a significant amount of advantage, either through income and education. But there are people that are essential for our society that will not benefit from work from home and cannot work from home. And the impact of COVID, what additional supports what additional effort do we need to put into our community planning to make sure that the new challenges that essential workers that have to be at a workplace, that have to travel, are supported through our community plans.
So some of this is going to be handled, I think, more wholesome or more holistically through other lenses, specifically when we talk about social equity and about housing. But again, from a transportation perspective, the research done through COVID really shows the importance of the transit service for the people that have to travel, who cannot work from home. And as TransLink was facing major budget deficits, both senior levels of government recognize the need to continue to fund transit service in order to provide the basics that society needs to respond to the pandemic, and also to serve people who must travel to work and provide those essential services. So I think that continued investment and increase in reliable, frequent transit is pretty essential for those people that can't work from home. And then that idea of complete communities where everybody can get what they need, walking and cycling, it continues to be really important for all segments of the population.
Well, that's actually a kind of a great segue into my next question, and obviously kind of bridges many topic areas, I think, as we're finding. When the concept of a 15-minute neighborhood is, that's the catchphrase for what we're calling it right now. But it was the walkable neighborhood when our OCP was established. Mm-hmm. How does that concept of a 15-minute neighborhood work outside of town centers? In the district, a lot of our population, a lot of our residents live outside of town centers. And so how does that concept work, and what would it look like to have that concept in some of our existing neighborhoods? And how might that either change or benefit a lot of the goals that we're trying to achieve in our OCP?
I'm not a broad planner, so I wouldn't speak to the land use component of that. But again, from a transportation perspective, I think that if sidewalks are complete and connected and accessible and comfortable, you can get quite a long way in 15 minutes. If AAA cycling facilities are complete and connected and safe, you can get even further within 15 minutes. So having those really great active transportation networks really allows you, sorry, you might be able to hear my kids trying to go to bed in the background here, really allows you to provide more. Of course, the denser the neighborhood, the more things you can provide for more people with less investment in a smaller space. But there's certainly ways and targets to be able to make sure people can walk to their schools, can walk to the convenience store, can walk to those things that they need in their less dense neighborhoods.
Thanks. And maybe I guess a question for David, Mayor Little, if you'll let me continue here. Sure. I read in the COVID supplement the concept of flexible zoning, or more flexible zoning for business. Maybe would you have time to expand on what that might look like? What challenge right now are existing businesses having with kind of existing zoning regulations, and where would some flexibility improve their ability to serve our residents?
Thanks for that question. I think as businesses are pivoting in response to this this new condition, it's not just a matter of sort of managing their brick and mortar versus their online or social media presence. That's a key part of just accessing their customer base. But some local groups, cafes are looking to sort of add elements to their business which they may not have actually incorporated before. And without doing a deep dive into the zoning issues, which probably should be done, there might be some benefit to exploring where, and again, this goes back to outreach, right? This is like talking to the business community about those pivots that they might want to do. You might have a local coffee shop that wants to roast beans. You might have a local manufacturer that wants to, use the back of their shop in a different way than they did pre-COVID. So I think it's just a a matter of recognizing that businesses are adjusting not just their marketing approach, but maybe even their business model.
Okay, thanks. I'll leave it there. I've got more questions, but I'll let some of my colleagues.
Your Worship, if I could comment. One of the fundamental issues that we've heard about is that the district zoning bylaw is so restrictive that it doesn't allow the necessary flexibility for businesses to pivot in COVID or other circumstances. And so that's something that I think we need to look at. It's not something we can do in the immediate future necessarily, but it's something we probably need to do in a longer term. But then we need to find some ways to allow some flexibility for businesses to survive in the next year. And that's going to be the challenge, because the zoning bylaw doesn't allow the kind of transition in a business from something that doesn't work now because of COVID to something that does.
I think it also extends to building code as well, though. There are a number of restaurants that have tried to, in order to achieve sort of lower density seating area, in order to be able to space people out, they've tried to expand into other spaces. And they found it very tricky to reconfigure a kitchen space with under the existing building code requirements. And so, yeah, it's zoning, it's building code. Sometimes it's parking allotments. If they want to build an outdoor seating area space, we've had a number of requests in Edgemont that are based around taking over their parking in order to be able to accommodate additional lower density seating to space people out. So, yeah, it's basically every regulatory model is currently not moving and flexible to adjust to those things.
So we can address that, but we need to work with council to do that.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. I've got Councillor back. Sorry, Mr. Milburn, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to give a concrete example to that zoning bylaw challenge. And a lot of businesses are trying to move out into the sort of mobile type service. So they might have a vehicle attached to it. And sometimes it's not actually related to the business necessarily. So they're trying to sublease or get some other business that maybe has some relationship. So a kitchen that's serving food isn't necessarily tied to the restaurant, these kind of things. And the challenge for us is, of course, we've got a fairly antiquated zoning bylaw, which doesn't adapt as quickly as businesses can conceive of different arrangements for a mobile business. So there's definitely opportunity there for work to be done to make some improvements without causing undue harm and impact to neighbors. Thank you, Worship.
Thank you, Mr. Milburn. Councillor Back.
Thank you very much, Your Worship, and thank you to you both for your presentations tonight. Like Councillor Bond, I was very impressed with just how you were able to pull these reports together, dealing with such an evolving situation, and it felt so like it was in real time reading it. So really impressed with the work that you've done. I'm interested in obviously all of this, but I'm going to touch on some of the economy and employment white paper and just some of the actions and things that you talked about, Mr. Bell. As the report suggests, I think coming out of this pandemic, we're going to really have to support the business community, and particularly these small businesses in our community. And one of the things you talk about is collaborating with the North Van Chamber and some other organizations within the business community. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, kind of what that could potentially look like. And you mentioned, encouraging head offices to stay here in our community, and what does that, what's the best way to kind of go about that?
Thanks. That's a great question. One of the key, call it a frustration from the business community, is just wanting more connection and outreach and involvement in some of their regular meetings, just to understand what their issues are on a regular basis. I think a great example of that recent outreach was the business survey that was done in December that looked at COVID-19 related impacts through the lens of this OCP review and the economy and employment lens specifically. But we see opportunity there for more participation, more involvement, and reporting back on what's happening. One of the interesting things about the district economy is how broad it is. So it covers so many different sectors, and they're all interlinked. So you might think of large scale marine industrial as being, what does that have to do with me? and the local mom and pop shop and the tradesman down. Well, it has everything to do with all of that. The economy is an ecosystem, and all of those sectors sort of nestle together. So I think the main thrust of that is just to better understand what different sectors are dealing with locally, so that there's more communication and exploration about potential solutions is really the main thrust.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the points that's made in the white paper around internal staffing and process is looking at our planning department and potentially creating some sort of a business liaison position. And I've myself as a counselor felt that there is a need for that. I know I often talk to small business owners who may have an issue, and I don't always know where to direct them. It just depends on what their issue is and if it relates to planning or some other department. So I could see that as being a step in the right direction if we were to have somebody that could be sort of that inside, champion for them within the district that I could direct them to. I'm just wondering how much economic development you think should be something that we do versus we rely on our other organizations in the community, like the North Shore Economic Partnership.
Yeah, that's a particularly good segue, because you don't have an economic development problem. You've got strong economic development. You've got companies that want to be there, that are there already. You've got companies that want to be there that aren't there. You don't have an ECDEV problem, you have other problems. And the reason why we called it a business liaison is to specifically focus on aspects that you just described and that I tried to cover in the presentation, which are around better exploring the challenges local businesses are actually facing, and having somebody that can help walk through potential solutions and explore them. So it's not an economic development problem at all. You've got strong economic development on multiple angles. This is about having almost like a steward in the district that understands and deliberately connects with the business community.
Yeah, I really see the need for that. Almost like that kind of business concierge kind of idea where they can come and we can help them. So no, I hear everything you're saying in terms of like having a seat at the table. I know I'm the rep on the North Vancouver Chamber. I know the mayor speaks regularly at chamber events, but just building more of those, the relationship there, I think would benefit our relationship with the business community. But that's just my initial comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Back. Next up, I have Councillor Curran.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for your work on the report. I also found it to be really informative. One thing I wanted to address is that we're all oftentimes at this table looking at symptoms of problems, and so I did just want to back up for a second and talk about COVID just briefly, because it is future pandemics. I'm reading actually from science. For the folks who are new here, I study climate science all day. So really looking at how this happened and how much more likely it is to happen. There's about 850,000 zoonotic diseases that could actually jump from humans to people. So just quoting from science here for a bit of framing, future pandemics will emerge more often, spread more rapidly, do more damage to the world economy, and kill more people than COVID-19, unless there is a transformative change in the global approach to dealing with infectious diseases, warns this new report from the IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And just a quote from one of the writers, there's no great mystery about the cause of COVID-19 or any modern pandemic. It is, from the chair, the same human activities that drive climate change and biodiversity loss also drive pandemic risk through their impacts on our environment, changes in the way we use land, the expansion and intensification of agriculture, and unsustainable trade, production, and consumption disrupt nature and increase contact between wildlife, livestock, pathogens, and people. This is the path to pandemics. So I do worry that at all levels of government, I don't think there's much understanding about the pandemic. And so I do feel like we have a responsibility to communicate some of the causes of this so that we can avoid future pandemics. So I just wanted to back up before I got into some of the specifics. Because I do worry. Again, I guess my point is that these are all symptoms. of models that are incompatible with sustainability. So in regards to transportation, I think the highlight for me is that it's space. Every bit of land that we do something with is space. And so how do we want to use that space to achieve human health, social justice, happiness, well-being? And I can guarantee that it's not cars. And so this is the transformation that needs to happen in this decade if we have a chance to achieve our climate targets, but also all of these other co-benefits that will come with this. So I love the idea of stepping up the action on reallocation of public space for public good. And I know that it's a challenge, but I think that it's something that we have to do with urgency. And as a small, do I keep going, Mayor? Did you?
Yeah, I didn't.
Okay.
I didn't catch up. I mean, we do have to be mindful of the time. So we have less than an hour left on this initial discussion, and we do have some more presentation.
Yeah, I won't be too. There's a lot, obviously, I want to say about looking at jobs. I mean, differently. I think that the idea of us really trying to have the jobs that are helping us get to this just, equitable, sustainable future are the types of jobs that we can promote and support. And I would say, as a small business owner in the district for the last 15 years, it is very, very challenging for a number of reasons. And as Jordan talked about, I don't always feel like the North Shore Chamber is the avenue for small business. I think that there's lots of different sizes business. And so we need to do a lot better job of looking at the really small owner operated, oftentimes those types of businesses, I think, get left out. And in the Cove, 3 businesses have closed, 3 retail businesses in Deep Cove, where I live, since the pandemic. So I'm happy to champion that cause as well. And I love the idea of having someone in our municipality being able to really support them. I mean, the highest and best use is obviously out of our hands, but I had one question. I read something in the jobs report saying that municipal taxes were forgiven for 2020, and I was just aware of the school tax. I don't know if sorry, I can't see my screen. If someone can speak to what was forgiven for small businesses, and then just pointing out the fact that I think we learned this with the grants and the loans that were coming in, is that a lot of times they benefit landlords and not renters. And so a lot of small businesses are renters, not landlords. And so there's a different impact there. But I think, yeah, the connection of all of these things, I mean, obviously that's what, there's lots of opportunities. I think when we look at food security and we look at how important it is to have good, healthy food locally, like shortening supply chains, it's just a really an opportunity, I think, through all of this to sort of build back better, as lots of people are advocating for, and really looking at a just recovery that brings everyone along. And yeah, so I get excited about the possibility of what we can do, and recognizing the gross inequity that this pandemic has had on people within our community and more broadly as well. But I guess I'll leave it at that, because I know we need to get moving. So thanks, everyone. I thought there was a lot of great information in the presentations to build on.
Mr. Wardell, you're on the call. Just wondering, are you aware of any commitments from the federal or provincial government for relief for businesses going into 2021, sorry. A little late in the year to be still saying 2020.
Let me try and get my video up and running here.
There we go. There is provincial grant funding. I do believe it's up to $30,000. There's an application process that people go through, including getting some professional advice that they have to pay for out of their grant. At this point in time, the province has expanded that program and acknowledged that their requirements were a little problematic, so there's not been a lot of uptake. There are some federal supports as well, but I'm not that familiar with the federal supports. Councillor Curran was correct on the baseline 25% school tax. In other words, on average, they dropped school taxes across the province by 75%. There's a conversation going forward as to whether that'll take place again in 2021, but the answer remains unknown at this point in time. And beyond that, within the limited tools that the province makes available to local governments, some local governments have reduced their tax burdens, at least in 2021, and this council dropped their taxes in 2020 by, did I say 2021? 2020 by 1% from 3% down to 2%, which you're aware of. So there's a very limited arsenal of tools. Most of those tools are in provincial hands.
Yeah, there was something, and I don't have it in front of me, that actually referenced like municipal taxes. And I know it was the school tax, so I don't know if it was just a typo and it was actually referencing specifically the school tax. But I would say that a lot of tenants will not realize the benefit of that.
Yeah,
they won't be told.
The one thing I haven't mentioned is what's known as MIVA, which is the Municipal Enabling and Validating Act, which the province created a permissive tax exemption regime for creating the potential for impacts on reducing the impacts of highest and best use. The challenge with that legislation, which Mr. Stewart alluded to in his last presentation, is it's very uneven in its application. So if you looked at, say, the top 20% of businesses in the district, what you would find is, and we'll be talking about this at Finance and Audit on Wednesday, is that those businesses aren't necessarily the businesses that you would want to target. And if you did target them, the tax redistribution under the legislation potentially puts a hit on the businesses that are suffering most, which the presenters have alluded to. The businesses that are really suffering are those that are in tourism and restaurants, etc. And those, in general terms, aren't the businesses that you'll see that are being challenged by highest and best use at this point in time.
Thanks. Yeah, there was. I'm aware of that one. It was a different one, but regardless, I just wanted to also say, like, in Deep Cove, staff worked so closely with the businesses, and I think that was really appreciated. I still hear people saying thank you so much to the work that the district actually did do to help to get patios built and quickly, and it was remarkable. And I think that's one lesson that we can take from this, is how quickly we can do things when we need to, and just, you know, basing our decisions based on science for everything we do moving forward is definitely a lesson that I think this shows. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Kern. Councillor Hanson.
Yeah, thank you very much, Your Worship. My question would be specifically for Allison and the transportation recommendation. And I've always been an advocate of transit, and obviously the idea of being able to move more people around in a climate-friendly way. It has a lot of benefits in terms of social equity. But I want, Allison, I'd ask you to respond to this question. I know when David Bell gave his presentation, he said, when we look at restaurants, it may never be that people want to sit as close to each other again. And David said that there may be a reconfiguration with respect to restaurants and space. I mean, is there a danger that because of the impacts of COVID-19 and potentially fear of other pandemics and just the change in our perceptions around safety and health, is there a danger that people will not ever feel comfortable returning to transit in the same numbers, and that we really have to rethink our transportation strategy at a more fundamental level, because transit simply is not going to become ever become as comfortable to people in terms of being in such a small and crowded space. So thank you both for your presentations. They're very interesting. All the material that you set out is very thought-provoking. And thank you to everyone who's been involved in bringing all this important information to this stage.
Thank you,
Your Worship, if I could comment.
Mr. Stewart first, please.
Yeah, just in response to Councillor Hanson's comment, I think he's made a very good point. We don't know right now how society is going to react to a post-COVID environment, recognizing that we might have more. And so we have to be really careful right now not to overreact to COVID. And I realize, I mean, it's so in our face. But the fact of the matter is, hopefully, we'll be going into 2022 with a different environment. And so I think our challenge right now is to be very measured in what we do, but be optimistic. You know, there's the old line that optimistic breeds resilience. And I think that we just have to be really careful. And I hear all the comments about COVID, but we will be past COVID, I think, in 2022. And so we have to be looking at an OCP review that is not fixated on COVID. You know, it has to be strong enough to react to a future pandemic, but we ought not to be just focused on COVID, because I honestly, it is not going to be before, believe me, September this year, going into next year. But there is an opportunity here, and I think we just need to remember that COVID is something that's going to pass. And in our discussions around the OCP, we need to be talking about 5 years, 10 years, 15 years out, and not be completely focused on COVID.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Alison Clavel.
Thank you. To Mr. Stewart's comment, I think we have every reason to be optimistic about transit. Of course, I don't have a crystal ball, but what we do know is that when people are surveyed, former transit riders report, for the vast majority of them, report that they will go back to transit after they're vaccinated. So that's one reason to be optimistic. Another reason to be optimistic is we have seen the impacts of pandemics of the past on countries that did suffer more from them. SARS, for example, where transit ridership did rebound after the pandemic was over. So we do have other experiences. Another thing that makes me optimistic, but we may see change in, is some of those other countries, mask wearing became much more commonplace more broadly. And so what we might see is people return to transit, vaccinated, wearing masks more frequently, as has happened in some other countries. And there have been some studies that indicate that mask wearing in transit has vastly reduced transmission on transit that was happening earlier in the pandemic in other locations. So those are reasons I'm optimistic, and I think our profession is optimistic about the return to transit, with the caveat that, of course, I don't have a crystal ball.
Thank you, Ms. Clavel. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Murray.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentations. Yeah, I think it's just really too early to tell. I mean, last year we were dealing with one strain of COVID, and every scientist around the world was trying to create a vaccine to get us through it. And now we have two more strains that are more contagious than the original, or so they say. So we really don't know what the future holds. We continue to be right in the middle of it. But I think, and I've said this before, I hope there's a silver lining in everything, and the loss of life is not in vain. And what the world has gone through over the last year, but it's certainly shown us different ways to live as a society, what's important, how we can pivot, how we can do things differently that lessen the impacts. There's pros and cons to everything. Certainly the traffic in the last year. It returned to levels that we haven't seen in years. We could all of a sudden move around, and it was a 15-minute trip across the North Shore instead of an hour and a half. Ms. Clavel, you said that the return of the traffic was 20% in the AM, and did you say 15% in the PM below peak levels?
Peak direction, peak period.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's just the bridge volumes.
Right. And
that's not a broad measurement.
Right. It does seem that it is, it's more spread out during the day. And I guess it may have something to do with people's flexibility and the fact that they are maybe working from home. I note that I'm in the city of Vancouver once a week, and it's a ghost town. There's no one in the city of North Vancouver. You can get the best table in the best restaurant at noon on a Friday, no problem. In fact, you're probably one of the only people in the restaurant. And I've experienced that a few times. So the transit, I concur with Councillor Hanson. We won't know, and I guess SARS is an example, but SARS isn't COVID. And I think we still have a ways to go. Interesting on the economy and the employment lens, and thanks for plugging that highest and best use, Mr. Bell. That's been something I've been shouting from the rooftops for years, and I kind of feel like for most of the district, it's kind of too late. You know, the land, a lot of the land has already been sold to the highest bidder, and the businesses have been displaced. A lot of the light industrial has been displaced. A lot of the commercial retail has been displaced. But the report or the survey that was done, are we looking at doing another survey? Because the response rate, we got about 180 responses out of 3,100 that were sent out at Christmas. And I'm not sure if that was the best time to survey our small businesses who were trying to just keep their head above water in their busiest season at Christmas, asking them to take part in a survey. So I'm wondering to sort of gather information from a broader group of business owners. Are we going to look at repeating the survey when it's a little less stressful on local businesses?
Samantha?
Thank you very much. That's a good point to raise. We did work quickly to get a survey out before the end of the year, and I think overall we were really generally happy with how that came about and the responses we got, and the fact that we did get people interested in the first week in January and getting together to talk. What we will be doing after this series of workshops is framing the public engagement more broadly. So it's certainly something that staff can take back and take a look at how to make sure as we keep going through the process that we are reaching out to small businesses.
We have to be really sensitive about you know, working with businesses during this very stressful time, as that, you know, it continues to be a very, very stressful time, and asking them to take part in, you know, surveys when they are just trying to reinvent themselves. I note the Rio Theater, I think, is the best example of reinvention that I've heard in decades, going from a theater to a sports bar, and in just an interpretation of a bylaw. Interpretation of zoning. And so I look forward, Mr. Stewart, to that discussion we're going to have on rebuilding or redoing the zoning bylaw, because I think we can be flexible. We have to be flexible, and we certainly need to look at the document to allow more of us to understand it and make it easier to be able to implement these kinds of changes and these kinds of pivots. Tax reform, absolutely, and that's something that absolutely has to change. We talk about, in both transportation and the economy, about accommodating the need for curbside, but as we move out of this pandemic, if we do move out of pandemics, or how we move out of pandemics, curbside, is that going to ebb and flow, the need for that? I guess there was a comment about staycations, trying to encourage staycations in the region or on the North Shore. And I hate to say this, but I'm so sick of staying home. Having a staycation is the last thing. I was looking at trips to Maui because I just want to go somewhere else than here, as much as I love here. So is that realistic? Is curbside, we've taken a lot of our curbs to away from residents so we can accommodate cycling for different modes of transportation, or alternative modes of transportation. So how would we do that? How are we going to now take the bikes away to accommodate businesses needing the curb, and then home-based businesses sort of put up a bit of a battle when we took away their ability for their customers to park in order to accommodate cyclists, and now we're asking to move the cyclists so we can accommodate businesses that are not home-based but ones that have changed their model. So it's sort of, those are a lot of the complexities that I see in trying to be everything to everyone. And I'm not sure if it's realistic, but it'll certainly be an interesting conversation. Mayor Little, I would have hoped that these two, and I think we've actually done what I'm suggesting already, but these two items, transportation and economy, would allow us to sort of have more of a conversation. Are we getting on to the other two now, or that's next week?
Just sort of introduction level. There's 6 slides left, and there is one on climate emergency, and emergency climate was one of the other topic areas, but it's just a briefer. It's for a more fulsome discussion at a later workshop.
Yeah, I mean, 2 of these topics are huge, and there's so many questions. I mean, my papers are all filled with notes and scribbles, and I'm sure we could go around a few times each to ask questions and clarify things and make comments. I don't think 2 hours is enough for 4 massive topics on our white papers, and certainly it's a refresher from the last time we saw you, what a difference a year makes. And it would have been
scheduled.
Yeah, it would have been nice to have a bit more time, but those are my comments for now.
Yeah, and we have 6 workshops scheduled, and some of them are set up to start earlier in the evening to give more opportunity for discussion as well. They're not all under time crunches. I can turn it back to the presenter now. We got 6 more slides to get through for you there, and there you go.
Great, thanks. Jody Reckenmacher will lead this discussion, and this is intended was intended to be more than a refresher on climate emergency, because we haven't had that opportunity to discuss it all together, although we have had some insight through the white paper last spring. So good comments. Thank you for all your questions and thoughts so far, and again, appreciate the time and the flexibility that Mayor and Council you have in how we keep moving this process forward. So I'll turn this over to Jody, and then we'll have just a quick wrap up at the very end, but we've got still a good, decent amount of time to start this part of the conversation. Thank you, Jody.
Welcome.
Great. Thank you, Tina, and good evening, Your Worship, members of Council and staff. Thanks again for this opportunity to speak to the climate emergency component of the OCP review. So as Tina mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about the climate emergency white paper that was prepared in the spring of 2020, as well as the COVID supplement. So if we look at the climate emergency goal from the OCP, it essentially captures the 2 main components of climate action: climate mitigation, climate change mitigation, which involves reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, improving energy efficiency, and moving away from dependency on non-renewable fuels. The goal also captures the climate change adaptation piece, which is all about understanding the impacts to our community from changing climate and taking action to manage those impacts, and in some cases even realize opportunities from those impacts. So with the white paper, we're taking stock of what progress has been made to understand where the district's at, and then identifying what will really make a difference moving forward in the context of the district. So looking at progress since 2011, the 2011 OCP set direction for climate action, and there's a lot of progress to celebrate since 2011 with some significant actions and tangible results. A great example of a significant action was your declaration of a climate emergency in July of 2019. That helps to communicate the urgency of taking action and demonstrates the district's continuing commitment to the cause. So that's a great example of climate leadership, which is quite important in climate action, which I will get to later. The district has also undertaken major studies to further understand the impacts of climate change, the causes of climate change, what is releasing emissions within the district. And the district has adopted some key plans to inform climate action. So there's kind of a suite of plans that we consider to be related to climate action. There's your climate change adaptation strategy, Impact 2050, which is the community energy and emissions plan, the North Shore sea level rise strategy, and then there are a number of other strategies that still support climate resilience, like the Climate Wildfire Protection Plan, Integrated Stormwater Management Plan, etc. So these plans are really important because they outline clear actions that are practical within the district's context. And most importantly, they will make a difference in reducing emissions and increasing resilience to changing climate. You've also begun to take action in implementing these plans. So some examples, and I'm just going to talk about a few examples. There's a much longer list than what I will go through here, but just some highlights of these actions include building retrofits that have been done, implementation of the BC Energy Step Code at a pace that makes you leaders in the province, seeing developers, so some of the impacts of this, seeing developers listen to council and bring forward developments that are not dependent on fossil fuels. So an example would be the proposed Seymour Estates development, which has low carbon step code plus zero fossil fuel commitment for space and hot water heating. Beginning an outreach campaign focused on encouraging and supporting homeowners to switch from gas furnaces to electric heat pumps, developing an electric vehicle charging strategy, installing cycling infrastructure to support people using sustainable transportation options, wildfire treatment of high-risk interface areas, stormwater management projects, including channel and culvert upgrades and flood protection. So these climate projects and actions, they don't always scream climate action. Sometimes it does look as simple as upgrading a culvert to provide better conveyance of rainwater. And then simply integrating climate action into decision-making across the organization. So we often talk about climate action as a lens that we apply to all actions. So that has begun within the district. What are the results of these actions so far? Where is the district at? A lot of the data that we have is not going to be new to you because it's from the Community Energy and Emissions Plan. So I'm going to talk about data or impacts from three areas: corporate emissions, community emissions, and then also where the district is at with respect to community resilience or climate adaptation. So with corporate emissions, these are emissions that are related to the district's operations and they're within direct control of the district. And we saw a reduction of 10% from 2012 to 2018. So this is a trend that's going in the right direction. And so it's a matter of continuing in that direction at a pace that will help you to meet your targets. With community emissions, these are emissions that are generated within the district, and the district has an important enabling role in reducing these emissions. They're down from 2007 to 2016, but the caveat is that business as usual would see an increasing trend of emissions. So overall, a 19% increase by 2050, and that's just due to expected population and employment growth. So your community energy and emission plan targets a 45% reduction below 2007 levels by 2030, and then net zero or 100% reduction by 2050. The primary cause of emissions in the district is reliance on fossil fuels. That's for primarily transportation and for heating buildings. So we know that over half of community emissions are related to transportation, and a large majority of these are personal vehicles commuting across low density single family areas. And that more than 40% of current emissions are from buildings. So these numbers about emissions from transportation and buildings show a clear relationship to the other topic areas of the OCP. And this connection is so important when it comes to climate for this OCP review. The actions that I was speaking of earlier, they're a sample of actions that are categorized as climate related, but because climate change is so connected that when you're talking about making investments that help people get around by walking or cycling or using transit, these are transportation actions, they're also climate actions. When you're building a diverse range of housing forms, particularly those that help people live in compact transit-oriented development, these are housing actions, but they're also climate actions. So there are lots of opportunities for co-benefits within climate action. Looking at community resilience and where is the district at with community resilience, well, we already know that the district is experiencing challenges related to extreme weather. This is not a future state. It's already happening. We've seen heat waves, drought, regional wildfires that impact air quality, and intense rainfall that causes flooding and debris flow. We know that sea level rise will impact the district, and vulnerable areas have been identified in the sea level strategy, along with actions to improve resilience of these areas. Resilience connects to the other topic areas because homes, businesses, transportation systems will all be impacted by extreme weather and sea level rise. So as the district continues to advance goals in those three areas, it's really important to apply a climate lens to make sure that efforts to improve in those other areas aren't undermined by climate change in the future. So what will make a difference? And sorry, Nicole, you can progress on the slide. What will make a difference? There's a longer list of actions in the climate white paper. And a lot of these actions are aligned with and included in the suite of your plans that I was referring to earlier. But the three actions that will provide the greatest return on investment for the district within the district's context are related to transportation, homes and buildings, and increasing the resiliency of municipal assets, including built and natural assets. So when it comes to transportation, it's a lot about what Allison was talking about. It's enabling more people to travel using sustainable modes of transportation, be it walking, biking, or transit, and doing that specifically through things like transportation demand strategies, enabling a shift to electric vehicles, and focused development of the town and village centers. So Allison spoke about this as a key transportation action. David spoke about this as a key action for economy and employment lands. But developing these complete and transit-oriented communities is also critical to achieving the district's climate goals. So it accounts for nearly a 20% reduction in the 2050 emissions. It's an important climate action. It's critical. Under homes and buildings, this is all about improving efficiency of homes and buildings and switching to non-carbon energy sources. So taking actions like promoting and incentivizing building retrofits and the replacement of natural gas powered furnaces with electric heat pumps. And then third, increasing the resiliency of municipal assets, including built and natural assets. So again, that's about bringing a climate lens to all decisions, particularly infrastructure decisions, including asset management decisions. So that is all about building new infrastructure to be low carbon, energy efficient, and resilient to climate change. It's ensuring that when assets reach the end of their life cycle, they're replaced or renewed to be resilient and low carbon. And there are some good examples. This is something that's already happening within the district. So for example, the district's culvert renewal projects are primarily driven by condition, age, and capacity. But when they're designed for replacement, then the future predicted state of rainfall patterns is a significant consideration in determining new infrastructure. Another example in the theme of asset management and integrating climate action and asset management is through the conversion of the district's fleet to electric vehicles. So when available, replacement and new vehicles are electric, and that's based on when vehicles are due to be replaced. So it's taking advantage of that opportunity, that life cycle renewal opportunity. And then natural assets are a critical component of this. The district has a wealth of natural assets, which you're all aware, and these really need to be understood and protected in a way that enhances community resilience. They're so important. So the good news story that has emerged through this OCP review and climate action is that these actions are practical, doable, and they have so many co-benefits to the other topic areas of this OCP review. The roadmap for implementing these actions already exists in the district plans. And so what's really required is sustained and consistent implementation of the plans adopted by the district and integration of the climate lens into day-to-day business. Next slide. So these are some quotes that were collected during stakeholder engagement. And these quotes just further highlight the connections between climate action and the other topic areas. So supporting people with sustainable transportation options and enabling them to live close to work are climate actions, as well as transportation and economy actions, housing actions. Next slide. How did the COVID-19 pandemic impact climate actions that the district may take? So as Allison mentioned, the pandemic translated to instant changes in how we work, travel, and live, had a really significant human impact that's been challenging for everyone. And in the context of the district's climate actions, the most prominent impact has been to greenhouse gas emissions. So globally, we saw emissions decrease by 7% with all of those changes to how people are living, working, and traveling. 7% in 2020 compared to 2019. But the long-term impact on emissions is unknown. There's lots of questions and lots of speculation. Again, no one has a crystal ball. So globally, emissions are expected to rebound, especially with economic recovery. Locally, the district could maintain some wins with maintaining long-term emissions reductions with investments in active transportation infrastructure and repurposing streets, as Allison had discussed. But the district may also see increases to emissions from buildings with changes to how ventilation systems are being operated to reduce risk of virus transmission. And so we don't know how permanent these changes are yet, and the impact on those emissions needs to be understood at a building by building level. We can't make generalizations about what that looks like. So again, lots of questions about the long-term impacts on emissions, but even with that uncertainty, the actions that will advance the district's OCP goals remain unchanged. So COVID has not significantly altered which actions might make a difference, but what it has altered is that the post-pandemic recovery might impact when targets can be achieved. And there are a couple of ways that this could play out. And if we consider a spectrum of worst case scenario to best case scenario, in the worst case scenario, implementation of climate plans could be stalled in favor of singularly focused economic recovery rather than looking for projects with co-benefits to invest in. This is problematic because delaying climate action creates bigger problems down the road at a bigger cost to society. So it creates challenges. The district can avoid this by continuing to demonstrate climate leadership, both through direct action and advocacy with senior governments to make it clear to residents, businesses, and other levels of government that pandemic recovery can be an opportunity for climate action. In the best case scenario, end of that spectrum, provincial and federal recovery stimulus programs can be used by the district to speed up implementation of climate plans and potentially even hit targets earlier. So the district can do this by identifying priority climate action projects to be ready to seize funding opportunities that are being announced and applying a climate lens to any project, which can help increase likelihood of funding. We can't take anything for granted, but based on the stimulus programs released so far and what we've seen from provincial and federal governments, it appears that the recovery could look more like the better case scenario. So certainly nobody asked for the pandemic or the many serious impacts that it has had, but as was pointed out earlier, there is a silver lining, and the silver lining here could be that this could be a very exciting time for the district as you've got a foundation of plans in place that outline a clear path for action. And now there are new resources becoming available to help you implement those actions and achieve your targets. So with that, I will open it up to questions. Pass it back.
Okay. I don't see any questions. So there are 2 slides left, and the last 2 slides are just very sort of simple next steps kind of stuff. So if we can just have maybe a couple of quick comments from council, and I do have a member of the public signed up to speak, and I know they've been very patient waiting to the end to speak, but you know, if we can quickly go through some council questions first, that'd be great. I've got Councillor Bond first.
Thanks, Mayor Little. I want to say something about my perception that I'm having, and you know, maybe Mr. Stewart can correct me on this, but I'm hearing from our consultant team and our staff team, and I'm hearing in the white paper that COVID hasn't necessarily changed what actions that we need to do. but it has elevated some actions and has elevated them in a way that it might be more important to take more actions sooner rather than later. And I think we heard that right now when Jody spoke. I heard that when Allison spoke. I heard that when David spoke. There's things that are in our plans that we need to do. We've already planned to do, but COVID has pushed them forward. We need to do them sooner. We need to do them faster. And in doing so, we're going to have a greater benefit where there's going to be co-benefits. There's going to be benefits for all of the challenges that we're having. But Mr. Stewart, you just said we need to, what I heard from you is that we need to well, hold on, this is just COVID. We don't know how it's going to work. We need to kind of do the OCP, implement these actions on the, not just because of COVID, but also from the OCP. So I'm getting the feeling there's a bit of a mismatch between what we're being presented here about taking these actions, these necessary actions faster, and kind of taking a bit of a stand back approach and waiting to see what happens. So, I'd like to hear, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm perceiving this in the wrong way, but I would like to hear a comment on that.
Your Worship, if I could comment, I'm not saying that we need to stand back, that we don't need to act, but I'm saying that we have to be very careful and strategic about understanding the implications of COVID in a short term, medium term, and the long term. In the middle of a pandemic, you cannot make long-term decisions about how the world's going to work and act. And so I'm just suggesting that we need to be careful, but I'm not suggesting that we don't need to act, but we need to act on the understanding that, on the assumption and the optimism that COVID will be over by the end of the year. So what does 2022 look like, and 2023, 2024, and going on? That's all. I don't want to put too much attention to my comments about being reticent about COVID, but I would really not want us to be making long-term planning decisions based on a short-term, what appears to be a relatively short-term pandemic. And believe me, short-term is a misnomer. It's been horrible and long, 2 years. But 2022 will likely see us on the rebound of that. And so if we're making decisions about the kind of community we want to do, it can't be solely based on COVID. I respect the input on the COVID, and I also appreciate that there's going to be some long-term implications, but we can't be bound by COVID as we look forward.
Well, thanks for that clarification. I think the one point that I'd like to make, and it's probably been made a number of times, you've probably seen it in your social media come across, but in that rush to return back to quote unquote normal, it's really important for us to consider what parts of normal that are worth for us to rush back to. And so, what I'm hearing from these papers is that we can do a lot more, and we can have a lot more benefits by taking early action on all of these issues. And so, I wouldn't be as hesitant to take action, and to take action sooner, and be bolder with our action, and more comprehensive in our actions. So I think that's what I'm taking away from the presentation from staff and our consulting team tonight. And so maybe that's my final comment then for the night, Mayor Little.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Bond. Councillor Kern.
Thanks for the presentation. I appreciate the conversation about the climate lens and all the work that staff has done in the past and is continuing to do. I really think we have an opportunity to lead not just in the metro, but lead in the world, because this local action is where it's happening. It is not happening at the provincial level, is not happening at the federal level, is happening at the local level. And so I'm really thrilled with some of the work that's in progress. I would like to hear from Jody about consumption-based emissions. It's something that we talked about in our community energy and emissions plan. And I know that there's over 10 municipalities now that are looking at that. And just for everyone who doesn't know, it's looking at your actual emissions that you create as someone who flies and eats and does all of these other things, because we really need to be looking as a species at our impact on the planet. And so I guess for me, what was missing is the ecological piece, because if you talk to scientists, like they're like the climate piece, which is mostly thought of as too much carbon in the atmosphere, is exacerbated by and also caused from the same system that's causing nature to degrade at the rate that's unprecedented in human history. So I wonder about the ecological piece, if you could, and I know staff I'm always talking about that. I was really pleased to hear the natural asset integration, I think, into financial planning is critical. And then the equity piece is something that, we've followed green projects around the world and seen that they've actually exacerbated inequality unintentionally. And so really looking at what are the impacts of the actions that we take and how are they equitable and who's involved in making those decisions. So my lenses are always ecological, equity, and decarbonization, sort of three lenses, which all are framed under our job, which is sustainability, environmental, financial, all of the things that we're tasked with. I think we can all do through those lenses. So, but I would be curious about the consumption-based, what your thoughts on there and that, and then just framing it in terms of what science is saying that COVID, we would have to do what has happened every year for the next decade to achieve our targets. So if that gives anyone an indication of the scale and speed that we need to move. But when we get there, so much better, everyone. Like, high fives, please. Like, better world is waiting for us. It is not a technology issue, it is a leadership issue. So we can do this, and we have to move quickly without COVID. It's really sort of irrelevant to the climate and ecological emergency.
I think that was a question to Ms. Reckenmacher. I'm not certain what the question was, but go for it.
So I'll start with the consumption-based emissions piece. And something that I've been thinking a lot about with the COVID lens and climate is what COVID has taught us about how we might deal with the climate emergency. And so to put the consumption-based emissions, I think it's certainly a very important part of climate action. But the consumption-based emissions, as there's a diagram in your community and energy and emissions plan of consumption-based emissions being a bigger circle than your community-generated emissions. And the trade-off, though, is that the level of influence that the district can have over those consumption-based emissions is not as direct as the community-generated emissions. So the focus for the OCP review, the lens that we're taking, is really where does the district put your efforts to have the biggest impact? And so the three areas that I spoke about, they're not going to solve the climate emergency globally. If we take the lens of the pandemic, we know that it's really important to have a coordination between individual and collective actions. So doing things like wearing a mask and washing my hands, this is not going to save the pandemic or stop the pandemic. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I would say the same with the district's actions in climate emergency. They are absolutely necessary to make a difference. They're not going to solve the climate emergency, but they are the actions that are the highest leverage actions for the district to take, in my opinion.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. Buildings and transportation, I mean, those are the top two emitters and the ones we can influence the most. But I think it's also just behooves us to tell people the truth about the impact that we have and how we can do it differently. And it does take leadership. It takes examples of people doing it in order to happen. So it is a collective action problem. Totally agree with you. But I think that there's been a lack of leadership, and we have the potential to do that. And it's always hard until it's done. So let's just get her done.
Thank you, Councillor Kern. Okay, Mr. Stewart, did you have a quick comment? I've got saw you come online with your lovely beach background there, and
yeah, I know just reminds me of where I can't go anymore. So I just want to reiterate what I think what Jody has said is there is stuff we can do corporately, and we will do that, no question about it. And that's a matter of leadership, and we have done that, and we'll continue to do that. It's a question of how we convince a community to take the necessary actions, social actions, and behavioral actions to make these kind of changes. And that's going to be the challenge for us as a community. But I think we're up for it. But we need to recognize that it's going to require a whole bunch of partners, including federal and provincial levels of government, to recognize that these are fundamental, significant changes. And much like recycling over the years has become a more part of our society, the unfortunate part is, and Councillor Kieran will say this, we don't have the time to have an incremental approach to this. We got to have some significant changes. And so the challenge for council is, I can tell you as a CAO, we'll make all the challenges, and we have, all the changes, and we have for many years in terms of energy consumption, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Our biggest challenge is going to be for our community, and helping them understand the changes that are needed to be made societally, which many of them may find very uncomfortable and very expensive in some ways. So that's going to be the challenge. But I mean, we're as an organization, we're up for it. You know, we've got to sort ourselves out, and I'm pretty confident that we can do both components of that. But there's no question it's not going to be a slam dunk by any stretch of the imagination.
Mr. Stewart, I've got Councillor back, then I'd like to go to Mr. Teven from the public, and then I'll have some wrap-up comments. So Councillor back.
Thank you, Your Worship, and not too much to add. Again, just to thank our consultants for coming tonight and presenting. I really enjoyed all of your presentations. And just on the climate piece, I hear what my colleague, Councillor Bond, is saying, and I hear what Mr. Stewart's saying, and that, you know, we are on the right track, but it is going to be moving at a quick pace and then getting the community on board. I mean, I read the one quote there where you say people are concerned about the environment, but they aren't willing to change their behavior and drive less. And I think that is an attitude that we hear out in the community. And so it is going to be a matter of getting people to take, you know, those little actions while still moving at a pace that's going to be quick enough, you know, for us as a community. So yeah, lots of great information and stuff to think about. So thank you again.
Thank you, Councillor back. Mr. Teven, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. You have 3 minutes to address the workshop.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Peter Tevan, 1900 block Indian River Crescent. I don't know if that's necessary for a workshop, but it's habit. Thanks for this few moments to address you. I want to start with a definition I looked up today. Confirmation bias, a noun which is defined as the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs or theories. Now, the following is all my opinion, so please don't take offense. It's how I read things. But to me, these materials, these white papers that are read in the package for tonight's meeting are perhaps the most distinct examples of confirmation bias that I've ever seen. Reading through, I can't recall encountering a single page or maybe even a single paragraph where my reaction reading it wasn't either, I don't think that's true, or that conclusion is not supported to what the findings of data were that were mentioned. But there is one statement I do want to point your attention to that I see is very true, and it's in the foreword of the report on page 18 of the agenda package. And that statement, slightly paraphrased, is the following: the pandemic has changed how we move, work, live, and allocate resources in households, businesses, and every level of government. And I agree with that. COVID-19 has changed everything. From the point of view of a member of the public, which I know you all also are, I want to share with you what I think most of the people I know in the public have as concerns about how to navigate through this COVID world. First, our first priority is to keep our families and ourselves safe from contacting and contracting the virus. Our next priority is to continue to meet our financial obligations. Our third priority is to be able to still access government services, whether they're healthcare, fitness, direct government services like benefits or permits or whatever it is. And in order to achieve those goals, we want to, number one, first priority, avoid shared public spaces with others at all costs, whether that's at work, shopping, transportation, or even in recreation. And second, we want our governments to find ways to make services more accessible and available. However, our federal and provincial governments have made decisions that don't seem so much to be protocols on how to keep us safe, so much as they seem to be protocols to contain the virus once we get it. Conversely, our local government have made decisions that restrict, limit, and hamper our access to government, but and in order to obviously protect your own staff from exposure to us. As to the comments of these or content of these reports and papers, I want to point out that, in my opinion, a number of the data and conclusions they're either unreliable, like too small a sample size, or some of them, in my experience, are outright false. A little logical math for you. A resumption of private automobile use to pre-pandemic levels, plus a seemingly permanent reduction in public transit use, and plus an expressed intention on the part of the public to increase private car usage and decrease transit usage. You add all those things together, and it does not equal a need to further invest in empty public transit and punish drivers by implementing transportation demand management methods. That perhaps is the most glaring example of fallacy that I found in the report. A couple of things I want to point out. The survey data has a sample size of only 400, less than 0.5% of our population. And most statistical experts would tell you that's so low as to be statistically insignificant and dangerous to draw conclusions from. Most experts would say a sample.
Draw to a close.
I'm doing my best to motor through. Also, I want to point out public input. All these conclusions are drawn before you've engaged the public at all. So I really think that that will be very difficult. I'll wind up by saying that, you know, I started by saying COVID-19 has changed everything, but we seem to be drawing a conclusion that says our way forward is to change nothing. I urge you to go back, consult the public, look at the real data, at what it's really telling you. Because I don't know, like if anybody offered you a free airline ticket to anywhere right now, would anyone take it? I don't think the answer is yes. And I guess I'll stop there.
Maybe Lisa.
Maybe Lisa. In contravention of every federal law, but maybe Lisa.
Oh, Mr. Tevan, have a sense of humor.
All right. Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Tevan. Appreciate your comments. Just my own comments on this. You know, I really appreciate everybody's efforts to putting these reports together. I still, on the environmental side, I mean, we've been taking all of these actions, and I do believe we have been leaders in these areas. I still get a little frustrated when I see data that seems to be bound to emissions per capita, because in the case of the District of North Vancouver, it tends to mean that if you wiped out the forest and filled it full of people, that we would actually look better in the models and on paper, and than we would if we were actually retaining all of these lands for public benefit, which we do. And so I'm always leery when I see models that sort of tend to suggest that increasing population is going to magically make the improvement better. I mean, as we talk about the Anthem development, which I guess I should be cautious about chatting about, but it is going to be an increase in the number of people that's going to make it seem like it's more energy efficient and environmentally friendly. It's not actually going to improve the situation necessarily. It's just that on average, it's going to make it a lower consumption from some of these kinds of developments. And And we still do them, and we try to hold them to the highest standard that we possibly can for all of the reasons Councillor Curran stated in particular right now, which is building the capacity internally for our staff to be able to process these projects and take on these new technologies and get the advantages of these higher standards. But I don't know. I still have some frustrations with how some of the data is presented. This OCP review is in large part, it's a recognition of what we've been doing. It's a recognition of what this council has been proceeding on, which projects we've been supportive. The levers to power within this council are very different to the levers to power in previous councils. And I think that the development community in particular is responding to it. But a lot of these things aren't waiting to be codified in the official community plan. These are things that we have already been doing as a council. The changes that we've been making on transportation, I mean, we've said it in the last couple of meetings, but a majority, we're moving to the point now where a majority of our active transportation budget over the next 5 years is going to be focused on active transportation. It's going to be focused on cycling and pedestrian and buses. And it's not going to be focused on traditional infrastructure such as driving lanes. And we're doing it already. Now we kind of got to go through the process of writing down what we're doing and what we still anticipate we're going to be doing over the next remaining 10 years of the plan. So it's not waiting. None of this is waiting. This is all stuff that we've been proceeding on all of these fronts. And so I get when people get frustrated that it's not advancing quick enough, or that maybe we should be more aggressive or more bold in things. We have the ability to do that already. We already have been doing that. We already have been changing the direction of development in this community to be more focused on affordable housing projects, more focused on rental housing projects, more focused on all of the things that we set out in our campaign and election material that we thought would make this community better. You don't wait for the OCP to do it. You do it, and then you have the OCP reflect the priorities that the community has imbued in us as an elected body. That is my sort of rant after the first night of our OCP review process in council. We got a lot more of this to come. The entire month of February is focused on OCP draft documents reviews. We have meetings out till 6 workshops from now. That's the one that was sort of optional, may have some space to move around more COVID discussion into that as well. But this is pretty much from here until spring break. This is going to be the types of discussions that we're going to be having about our community and the types of presentations. So I want to thank everybody for their patience and their participation, and thank the staff for preparing the materials with the consultants. And I look forward to us continuing these discussions at our next workshop, which I believe the next one, Mr. Milburn, is next Tuesday night at 5 o'clock. Is that correct? I'm seeing nodding heads from Ms. Atva and Mr. Milburn, so we're good on that one.
Thank you, Worship.
Thank you. So having completed that at this point, I will accept the adjournment. Councillor Murray has moved adjournment. I accept. Thank you all so much for your participation tonight, and look forward to continuing the discussion next week.
Good night.
Night.